Okay, so we'll get started in just a second here. Get brackets open. It's probably in your downloads. I know some of you have your own computers, but on the school computers, it should still be in your downloads. And then you can't drag it over to the applications folder, but you can double click it and it should open. Sometimes it takes a little while, so we'll burn through some time while we're waiting. So, okay, so we're streaming with no dropped frames, perfect, picking up the audio. So, assignment number 1 has been graded. Just as a quick thing, I always post the old class examples, and I realize sometimes in class maybe you like fall behind on an example and you just can't catch up, and you're just, it's just too difficult. There's always the recorded lecture, but when you go to do your assignment, make sure that you use the version from class examples, because sometimes I'll see assignments that are like vastly different than what we did in class, and I get that maybe you fell behind it and you made a mistake or something like that, but keep in mind that if your goal is to complete the assignment, as I'm the grader and I'm giving you an example, the best path is probably use the examples that I give you, okay? So start with those class examples. Don't go to all kinds of different places on the web looking for information. Try to stick to the stuff we do in class. That's all I'll say about that. But just remember that you do have these class examples available, and there's a reason I give them to you, is because most of the time they serve as like some sort of starting point for an assignment or something else. Okay, I'm not expecting you to do a lot of this stuff just out of thin air from scratch. You usually have a starting point. And oops, not attendance, we want assignments. So assignment number 1 is graded, and just look at any comments I made about that. And sometimes I'll make a very general comment. Usually the reason I don't go into a whole bunch of details, because I want you to go back and look at the class examples and see what's different from what you did and what we did in the class example, okay? Because if I just walk you through the answer, it doesn't really help. Part of the learning process is going through and seeing what you did wrong, okay? So that's graded. Assignment number 2. Okay, that is due this Friday. I'm hoping that most people in here, I can't really check to see who submitted it because we're in class and we're recording, but I'm hoping that most people already got this complete. If not, get this done like right away. The only reason I do the Friday due dates is normally I do them on Tuesdays, but I wanted, for anybody who was watching the lecture at home, I wanted to give them a little bit of extra time. So get that done. And then there's going to be a new assignment today. I didn't make this one due on a Friday because it's due in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks plus a Friday, that might be a little bit too long. So I just decided to do exactly 2 weeks. Keep an eye on these points. Remember that 11 points, that's over a whole letter grade. So you want to make sure that you put some time into the assignments. Don't just like hurry through them really quick, because if you don't do well on the assignments, that's the bulk of your grade. That means you're probably not going to do well on your final grade. Okay. And I'll explain this later as we get to that point in the class. Any questions in general on due dates or anything like that so far? That's good. And we are still streaming. Perfect. Okay. Let's go ahead and do our normal, go into our normal stuff that we do here for setting up for class. So create a new folder for today. So 9-15-2020. And then let's go over to brackets. And let's go to File, Open Folder. Now before we were using this method of trying to click this thing, I just like going to File, Open Folder. I never realized this was actually here. And this to me seems a lot simpler to explain, so we'll use this. So we'll go File, Open Folder. And then we'll go to our 9-15-2020 that we just created. And we'll go to File, New, create a blank file there. Okay, so while you're getting that all set up, let's go. I'm going to go to Resources, W3 Schools HTML. So what I usually like to start off with in class is a quick review of what we did the class before, and I go through it a lot quicker because it's review. So let's very briefly talk about lists and tables, which is what we did last class. So, as I explained before, most of these HTML elements are actually pretty straightforward, like header, footer, main, paragraph, H1 through 5. It's like you get a little explanation of what the tag does, and then you can pretty much directly use it. There's generally not a whole lot of restrictions on how it's used. They tend to be pretty self-explanatory. Even article requires a little bit of a structure, but it's pretty open. There are some that require a very specific structure. Those two are lists and tables. So I'm under W3 Schools HTML. You scroll down to lists. I'm going to click the try it yourself. We'll write it from scratch. Sometimes it's good to get in the habit of writing these things from scratch just so you get a little bit of practice. And the way you structure a list is that it's either an unordered list or an ordered list. So UL for unordered, OL for ordered list. And then within that, we have LI for list item. So it's not a huge amount of structure, but there is a special structure. I can't just put random things in here. I can't just toss in like a paragraph or anything like that. It has to be this very specific structure of either a UL, OL, and then a bunch of these list items. I can't have a list item by itself. This isn't valid. So it's got to be within that very special structure. But outside of that, it's not terribly difficult. And you'll notice that there's some styling associated with it, but you can actually change the styling. We haven't really gotten to CSS, so I don't want to confuse anybody. We'll probably start CSS, I guess, next class, something like that. But we do see some default styling associated with that. So that seems pretty reasonable. We see the bullet points for an unordered list, which makes sense. And if you hopefully you remember from before, this ordered list, I don't particularly like this ordered list because what did we use last time? I think we just did something simple like how to toast a piece of bread, correct? And the ordered list, the idea is that it's something that happens to go in order. If you ever get confused, I always like to go back to a recipe. A recipe will list a bunch of ingredients. That would be an unordered list, right? Because you just gather the ingredients. In general, it doesn't really matter. You're just kind of placing them on the counter. But then we actually make the item. The order does matter. For example, you can't just put an empty pan into the oven. You got to follow the directions. You have to mix some stuff or whatever the directions happen to be, and then you cook the item. Okay, you can't cook it and then take the pan out of the oven, mix everything, and put it in the pan and serve it. Or any other direction like changing a car tire. Any sort of directions generally tend to fall into ordered lists pretty well. So let's go ahead and make one. Let's go over to in Blackboard under resources. Let's go to HTML shell. And this is going to serve as our starting point. Now, W3 Schools is okay for trying very small examples, but I do like to maybe the first time demo it in W3 Schools, but then after that, I like to try to write stuff from scratch where possible. So let's go ahead and copy and paste this. So I'm going to hit Control-C, or if you're on a Mac, it would be Command-C. And then paste it in. And then I'm going to use Control Command S to save. And then we'll call this, make sure, it should have defaulted to the correct spot, but CGS1821, today's date, perfect. And then we'll call this ex1.html. Now don't forget that we installed that extension. One thing that I did notice on a lot of the assignments was a lot of weird indentation. If you use this extension called Beautify, so if you go under Available and type in the word, you can see it right there, Beautify. Mine says Update, but you can click Install. From there, there is a special setting, Beautify on Save, so that every time you save it, notice that when it came from W3 Schools, it wasn't really formatted perfect. Right when I saved, it reformatted. Now, it's not perfect. Sometimes it does some odd things, but in general, it's pretty decent. There's a reason that this indentation is important, because when you have a very large site, it becomes pretty difficult to read HTML that's not aligned very well. The examples that we do in class are somewhat small. Once you get into past 50 lines or so, it gets kind of difficult to read if you don't have good indentation. Okay, so make sure within body, okay, just as I'm trying to talk about some common mistakes I've seen throughout the years. One mistake I often see is people put body, they'll have, say for example, they'll have two bodies. Your page can only have one body. The body is the actual body of the page. You only have this once. In the head section, I know we haven't really talked about this, but that can't be inside of body. I realize what happens sometimes is that maybe you highlight something and maybe accidentally drag it around or something, accidentally cut and paste something like that. Make sure this structure is very important, is that within body, that's where all of our regular HTML is going to go. Sometimes I'll see stuff like this, like paragraphs in just random spots. Be very, very careful about these details. It's not super difficult. It's not like say for example like other programming languages like a JavaScript or something like that, where there's a bunch of rules that you have to remember, but the few rules that you do have to remember, just make sure that you always follow them, because unfortunately with web pages it doesn't give you what's called a syntax error. It does its best to try to render the page, but the page isn't correct. Okay, so make sure that you're inside of body right here, and then let's start off with the unordered list. And let's say, for example, we're, actually it probably doesn't need to be separate. We can just keep it on its own line. Let's say, for example, we're thinking about supplies that we have to bring to go camping. A tent. Food. Sleeping bag. Okay, that would be an unordered list because it doesn't really matter the order particularly that we pack them. We just need to make sure that when we go camping we have these items. Or with an ordered list, the order does matter. Like say for example if you're trying to replace the processor in your computer, the first thing you do is open the computer case, move old, just say CPU, Install new CPU. There's some other steps, but you get the idea. Now don't forget that we can preview right in brackets using this live preview. And you'll see here the bullet points for the unordered list, and it gave us steps 1 through 5 for the ordered list. Because it really wouldn't make sense to remove the old CPU if we haven't even opened the case yet. Now, one more quick thing. You might think that, okay, well, this doesn't really make sense. How often are you putting these lists on your pages? It's very often the case that we use it for navigation. So there's a special tag called nav, short for navigation. So if you're on the IRC website, this right here, this would be the navigation. And it may not seem super obvious at first, but this is actually an unordered list. It's a list of links. And the order, even though you want them to appear in a certain order on your page, the order actually doesn't really matter. Just like our grocery list, like it might make sense to you, like you may come up with your own system. Like you might go aisle by aisle, maybe you get the cold items last, but the order doesn't really matter. Same thing here, the order of these links doesn't really matter that much. So what we can do is for our navigation, we can put in an unordered list. So you might have the home page. Now I'm not doing a real ahref like we did last week. We'll do that later today, but let me just save because this, there we go. So we might have our home page, a page for admissions. Now your first thought might be, this looks nothing like a navigation. Later on, we can change how this looks using CSS. I was going to show you an example that we did in another class where it's like it looks vastly different, but I don't want to be confusing. Just note that you could make this unordered list look like that navigation that we just saw, using some kind of advanced techniques in CSS. Not super advanced, maybe intermediate level. Okay, so any question on lists? Does anybody need the code up here for another minute or so? That's good. And everyone is typing the code that we do in class, correct? That's very important. Because it's very easy to look at the code and say, oh, okay, I understand that. You got to type it out. There's just something about typing some of these characters that you don't normally type, like the angle brackets and some of these slashes. Getting used to common mistakes. Understanding how spacing works, and it turns out that this and this are the same thing. You know, those sorts of things, okay? So it's very important that you type out these examples. I know you might think, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's easy. I'll just stare at the examples in class. But you get so much more out of it by actually typing it. Because otherwise I would just throw a bunch of PowerPoints up here and show you finished code. You know, we could get through probably 30 examples per class if we did that. Okay, so let's talk about tables. So I went to File, New. And inside of W3 Schools HTML, I'm going to click Tables. Tables are, again, not super difficult, but they do require their own special structure. I have to have the table tag. Don't worry about the style. This is actually CSS. I wish they hadn't added that. Can't really, oops. So we have this tag called table, and then we define our table one row at a time. So we have our TR, which stands for table row. Now the first row is special in that it's a heading. Generally, you don't actually technically have to, but most people like to put a heading. And so you can see here they've got first name, last name, and age. So this is the heading. And then here are the individual people with their first name, last name, and age. And again, we define these one row at a time. So the first row, we have TR, and then this TH is for table heading, but it defines the individual cells. And then same thing here, we're on the next row, we have a TD, and then we define the individual cells. Same thing next row, here we define the individual cells. So let's go ahead and create our own here. So we'll use the HTML shell again. So if you close that, either you can Google for HTML shell, or it's under resources, right here, HTML shell. Oops. Sorry, Control C, not Control S, and then paste it in, save it, and this will be ex2.html. And then make sure you are inside of the body section. Use the syntax highlighting to your advantage. Notice that when I click this, I see where body opens and where it closes, so I know that, okay, I need to put my mouse cursor here. So when I add new code, this is where it's going to go in the proper spot inside of body. So as I mentioned before, to create a table, we use the full word table. So we open and close that. One quick thing, notice that I open and immediately close the tags. I don't even think twice about it anymore. Brackets actually does it automatically for you. This is a good habit because one of the most common mistakes is forgetting to close tags or closing them out of order. By doing this, it sort of forces you into making the fewest number of mistakes. Now, you can always make a mistake, but because I've immediately opened and closed it and put my cursor here, it becomes a lot more difficult to make mistakes. You always want to set yourself up in programming habits to make the fewest number of mistakes. Okay. And the same thing here. So I'm going to define a table row. It's going to open and close the table row, and it puts the cursor in between for us. And then since our first row is going to be the heading, I'm going to create a TH. And let's just pretend we're doing some physics experiments. So I might have the experiment number. We're measuring some sort of force, some distance. Doesn't really matter too much. It's more about getting practice with the table. We can add a couple more rows here. So we'll say the next row. Now we're not using TH anymore because we're actually putting in our data. So this is going to be experiment number 1. The numbers here don't really matter. We're not even using units or anything. We'll just put in numbers. So TR, then we have a TD for table data. This is our experiment number, which is 2. Again, the actual numbers don't really matter. It's more about the structure. Remember I told you they say use it for tabular data. So this is a good example of that. Or if you've got a bunch of products in your store, and the first column might be the quantity, the second might be like a model number, the third might be the human readable name, next column might be the price. Those are good examples of tables. What you don't want to use tables for are to do layouts for your site, which was very common at one point when we didn't really have that many tools to do layouts, but we have very powerful layout tools now, so we don't learn them necessarily right away in this class. I teach you some very basic stuff, but you'll take a class, CGS1821, which we spend the bulk of the class doing layouts. Now if we view this, if you lost your link, you can click here. I still have mine open. Remember the thing we said is, okay, well, just to cheat, normally we don't want to do this. It's probably going to complain that, hey, this isn't a good idea. But we can add a border just to see the table. We typically do this in CSS, but we haven't learned CSS yet. By the way, this thing right here is called an HTML attribute. Anytime that we give an extra piece of information to the browser about that individual tag, that's called an attribute. We've seen a couple before. Like here, character set is UTF-8. This is giving extra information to the browser. This is saying, okay, this isn't really for the user to directly see. Like here they actually see the word experiment. Here this is passing to the browser. Here's some extra information. Go ahead and render a border around this table. Okay. But outside of that, they're fairly straightforward lists and tables. They just require their own special structure. So I like to dedicate some time to that. Okay. Any question on tables? So the next thing we do is going to require a few steps, and all the steps need to be done correctly. So I'm going to go through this very, very slow. So what we're going to do is we're going to go all the way back to our CGS1821 folder. So I'm going to go very slow. I'm going to repeat steps over and over again because it's very important that you set this up correctly. So inside of today's date, so again, everyone's at our CGS1821 folder, and then you made a folder for today's date. And then so we can already see example 1 and 2. And we will go ahead and make a new folder called links, L-I-N-K-S. So I'll go through that again. So inside of our CGS1821 folder, we're going to go into today's date. You're going to right-click, make a new folder. It's basically the same thing in Mac. You right-click, and I think they use the same terminology and everything. And then it's going to be called L-I-N-K-S, links. Make sure it's a folder, not a file. If you go back to brackets, you should see that here. All the way on the left-hand side, you see example 1 and 2, but you should also see that links folder. Now within that, we have to create one more folder. So we have to go, we're in CGS1821, today's folder. Now go inside of that links folder. And create a folder called family. This is setting up the structure for our hyperlinks, which we're going to talk about next. So we'll do that one more time. So back at our CGS1821 folder, we went to today's date. We already created a folder called links. Then we're going to go inside of that folder called links. And then we're going to make a new folder called family. It's very important that structure is correct because that's going to serve as the basis for our whole example. So we're only going to do 3 examples today, and this next example is going to pretty much take the rest of the length of class. Okay, is anybody confused about that at all? Very important that part is set up correctly. Now if you go to brackets, you should see links, and then if you click that, you should see a folder for family. Is everyone good? Okay. So under links, so what we're going to do is we're going to go to File, New, and we'll copy and paste HTML shell into there. And we're not going to save that in our normal location. So what we'll do, so you did File, New, you pasted in the code. Now normally we would have just called this ex3, but what I want you to do is go into that links folder, not into family, you should just be in links, and you're going to save it as a special name. It's going to be called index.html, all lowercase. So I'll go through that process again. You went to File, New, copied and pasted HTML shell, and then when you go to Save, you want to make sure that it's not just in this folder. You want to go inside of the links folder, and this is going to be called, in all lowercase, which is very important, index.html. When we do our file naming, we will always want to do everything as all lowercase. It's very, very important. If you don't, it's going to cause problems later. I'll say that one more time. When you name these files, make sure that they're named all lowercase. So when we ended class, so everyone's good with that? Does anybody need me to repeat that one more time? This is very important. One more time?
No, I had a question.
Yeah.
Is it under links?
Yeah, so it'll your final structure should look like this. Like when you go to your folder and you double click links, you should see a file in there, your index file, and then you should see family, which right now is empty. Is that what you have?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So now we're going to learn about hyperlinks. Now, at the end of class last week, we kind of started in talking about hyperlinks a little bit. The basic idea is that you've got a bunch of what Tim Berners-Lee would have called documents. Now we just call them web pages. And at any point, I can go to a different web page just by clicking a link. So the full name is called a hyperlink. I click that hyperlink, and then I go to that next page. We don't even think twice about it. You go to a website, and you can, within the first 5 seconds of being on the site, probably click, a dozen different links. But back in the late 80s, early 90s, that wasn't very common with systems, is that you didn't have what was called hypertext. There were hypertext systems, but they just weren't that common. And so this is probably one of the most revolutionary features is again, he didn't invent it, but he kind of popularized it to where people used it. And so if we go to under resources, if I can find it, here we go. I'm already there, I guess. So W3 Schools HTML. We're going to go to HTML links. So you can read more. By the way, the reason I click through these, I could just tell you the information. I want to show you where it is. That way, if you go home later and you want to read more about this, you can. The basic structure of it is that we use this special tag called A, which stands for anchor. And then we use an HTML attribute. Remember we just talked about these? And it says it's href, which stands for hyperlink reference, equals, and then some double quotes, and then some stuff to display to the user, and then that's it. So here's an example, is that we have href equals, and then this is called a URL, Uniform Resource Locator. And it has a special structure. We won't get into the structure too much. This piece of information is given to the browser, as the HTML attributes always are, is that I give the browser this information because it knows to do something special with it. Most people don't actually care the full URL. What they care about is that when I click it, it goes to the right spot. However, we do want to display something to our users, and that's what we display here. Okay, I've seen people get this reversed in the past. It's the stuff, and this is true across the board, the stuff between the start and end of the tag. That's what we display to the user. And then this stuff here is information we give to the browser. So let's create one here. So let's just make a paragraph to hold this. We'll say href equals, and then we'll just put empty double quotes. And we'll say IRSC admissions. And then we'll go to the IRSC website in a second here, and we'll paste that link in from admissions. So it's A space href, which stands for hyperlink reference, and then equals, and then we're going to do a couple of double quotes, but we're going to leave those empty for now. And then make sure to end the, so we do the /A. Remember, these occur in pairs, and notice that it's highlighted green so that we know where it starts and ends. And then this part right here is what's displayed to the user. So there's a bunch of different cases on how to work with links. Let's talk about the simplest case first. So let everyone just go to the IRSC website. And there should be a link right here, admissions. So again, everyone go to the IRSC website. Let's click admissions. And then what we're going to do is we're going to copy this. So I just highlighted it. I'm going to Control C to copy. And then you're going to paste it right here between the double quotes. Now don't forget that we can hit the Enter key as many times as we want. It's white space independent. So to me, this is a little bit difficult to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spread it over the rest of the line to make it a little bit more readable. So this is the simplest of all the different cases. This has the full URL. It has what's called the protocol. It has the site name, which is www.irsc.edu, what's called the DNS name. Then on some server somewhere is a folder called admissions, and then some file called index.html. Now if I bring up our page, and so notice that because I wrote that here between the start and end of the tag, IRC admissions is displayed. I gave it the hyperlink reference, the href, and once I click this, let's see if it takes me to the correct page, and it did. By the way, when you click links off-site, it breaks it, so you have to close it and click this again. So you might think that's super simple. That's the end of the story, right? Well, there's a bunch of different ways to include hyperlinks, and there's advantages to each. Okay? So that might not make a whole lot of sense. Let's do this. Let's go to File, New, copy and paste in HTML shell. So File, New, paste in HTML shell. And then again, we want to save it in a very special location. We can't just put it again in our 9/15/2020. We want to go inside of our links folder. Okay, so not in family. What we're going to do is we did File, New, paste it in our HTML shell, File, Save, and we want to go inside of the links folder, and we're going to call it hobbies.html. Now if I go over here, this is our 9/15/2020. I go inside of links. We see our index page and our hobbies page. By the way, index is a very special name you'll see later on. And don't forget, these have to be lowercase. It's very important. It may seem to work now, but we're going to do an assignment later based on what you do today. And I just see so many pages break because I'll get into case sensitivity later. But it's it may seem to work. You may think, oh, what's the problem? It's because you can have files that work on your computer and then you upload it to a server and it no longer works, and then you're going to go crazy, like wondering what did you do wrong. And let's just create a dummy page that all it's going to have is in H1. And just so we can keep track, it's going to say hobbies. Let's actually do the same thing with our home page. So here we had, this is our hobbies page, hobbies.html. And let's do the same thing here, just so we can keep track. We'll just call this page home. So we've got our home page. I'm sorry, let's do it as an H, makes more sense as an H1. So I wrote it as a paragraph, let's do it as an H1. And we'll just call it home. So we've got our hobbies page as an H1 and our index page as an H1. So we've got our simplest case. Let's make a new paragraph. And we'll do href, some empty quotes. So let's just set up the skeleton for it. Let's say, for example, I'm on my home page and I want to be able to send the user over to the hobbies page. So go to hobbies. You might think, oh, well, I'll just send them to https://www.irc/hobbies or something like that. Well, we can't really do that for a number of reasons. One, we're not actually working on a server. But two, it's not really necessary or needed right now. So what do we put between these double quotes? We just write the word hobbies.html. So we already did the first one, which is very simple. This is just the first URL. In this case, which I guess would be our second case, if the file is on the same server, in the same folder, all we have to do is write the file name. I'll say that again. If the file is on the same server, in this case our computer, and it's also in the same folder, we just write the actual file name. These are called relative links. It's saying relative to where I currently am. So where am I? I'm right here because I'm on the index page. How do I get to the hobbies page? Well, it's in the same folder, so just go to hobbies.html. Let's test that. So go to hobbies. It correctly took me to that page. Now, just as a quick note, I want to explain this because I see this in assignments. Don't use the leading slash. It may work, but it's no longer a relative link. It's what's called an absolute link. And you're introducing problems. There's times to use relative, and there's times to use absolute. I don't even really talk about absolute in this class, even though they are important. I just try to, I realize most people in here are digital media, and this is an intro class, and you should be able to make your sites just using relative links. There are times to use absolute, but it's kind of outside of the scope of this class right now. So I will take off points if I see things like this. Now take a second, go to your hobbies page, and everyone take a couple minutes, because now when I'm at the hobbies page, I can't get anywhere. So I want you to add a link based on what we did here, an index, to go back home. So you create a paragraph in an href, and I want it to say, instead of go to hobbies, it's going to be on your hobbies page, and have it say go back home. So take a couple of minutes. We're doing good on time, so get a little bit of practice. Okay, so somebody walk me through. So I've got my cursor right here. I'm on the hobbies page. What do I need to add first?
Paragraph.
So paragraph, perfect. We added the paragraph. Now what do I add inside of the paragraph?
You add a hyperlink, which is the A.
Exactly. So we want to just start off with the skeleton. That's a good starting point. I always tell people don't write code one character at a time, because what you want to do is write kind of placeholders and skeletons of things and then go back and fill things in. So I've got what a hyperlink looks like. So let's say I wanted to fill in right here first. What could I type here? Go back, let's say, to home page. Okay, perfect. Because that's going to be displayed to the user. What would I put here? Perfect. Index.html. Be very careful of this, because sometimes people will just write index, but remember that's not the file name. Even though the operating system likes to hide these file extensions, is that the actual name of the file is index.html. And then now I should be able to go back and forth between these two pages. So hobbies, and then back to the home page. Hobbies, back to home page. So that's the simple case. Well, the simplest was an external URL, but when two pages are on the same server, which in this case is just our computer, in the same folder, we just do that. Now, if it were that simple, we could end lecture, but you see here we've still got 20 minutes left, so it's not that simple. Let's go to File, New, and with HTML shell, let's go ahead and paste that in. And then you'll notice that we made a folder called Family. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this. So let me explain the need to create folders in the first place. So the whole need for creating folders is that you could dump all of your pages into one folder, which would be fine, I guess, but imagine IRSC. If you've got thousands and thousands of pages and they're all in one giant folder, it's not a very good organizational technique. So if you've got a bunch of pages that seem to want to be grouped together, usually you create a folder for them. So in this case, if I've got, say, 7 or 8 different pages describing family members, like mom, dad, brother, sister, so on, some of your cousins, that would be a good example of taking all those pages and then putting them into a folder. Now to save time, we're just going to do one page, but you get the idea. So what we want to do is, with this empty page, we're going to save it. We're going to go in links, just like we did before. And you should see your old hobbies and index page. But now we're going to go all the way into the family folder, and we'll call this page mom.html. So again, I did file, save, and then we wanted to make sure that it saved all the way in this family folder. So the date, links, family, you should see your mom page. So if I'm at my index page, my home page, and I want to, oops. So let's set up so I'm at index.html, and let's create an empty ahref. And let's say I want to somehow navigate to the mom page, well, it's not so simple anymore because remember the rule. The rule said, so right now, I'm here. I'm at my index.html page. I can't just type mom.html. It's actually in what's called a subfolder. So hobbies is in the exact same folder, but mom.html is in a subfolder. So what we have to do is we have to direct it. We have to say, okay, first go into that subfolder called family, and then we separate it with a slash, and then, and by the way, you can see brackets giving us some help here. Then go to mom.html. So I'll explain that one more time. We're right here at our home page. We're at index.html. I can't directly just write mom.html because even though it's in a subfolder is not the same thing as being directly in the same folder. So with hobbies, I was able to just write hobbies.html, but with mom.html, I can't do that. I have to first say traverse into the family folder, go into that folder, and then go to mom.html. So let's test that now. So I'm on the index page. I click mom, and it correctly takes me to that page. So you notice that it went into this family folder, and now I'm at mom.html. So any questions about that? So if you're at a folder and you need to go into a subfolder, you just type that folder name. What if I had two subfolders? Let's say within family, I had a bunch of cousins, and I wanted to separate them into their own folder. Then I'd go into family, cousins, and then the names of your individual cousins. So you can use these subfolders as many times as you need to. So that's the second case. The first case is when two files are in the exact same folder. The second case is when something is in a subfolder. With hobbies, we're able to very simply write index.html to go back to the home page. So right now I'm in mom.html. I've set up our skeleton. This is going to be the text that's displayed to the user. But this isn't as simple. I can't just write index.html because remember our rule said that. So right now I'm inside a family. And I want to go to index.html, but it's tough because I can't just write index.html because it's not in the same folder. It's not in a subfolder. It's what's called up one level. Notice that this up arrow right here, Mac, it's probably got something equivalent. But if we want to go up one level, so right now I'm in family, if I went up one level, it would take me into links. And so we need something to be able to take us up one level. Bless you. To do that, we go ... which means go from our current folder up one level. And then from there, we should be able to see that, okay, I see the index.html. So remember the basic rules. The easiest was when you have an external link to another server, you just give the full server information. The next is when two files are in the exact same folder, all we have to do is write the file name. When something is in a subfolder, we write the subfolder name / and then the file name. And then when we need to go up a level, we do // which means go up a level, and then we can get to it from there. Now, this may seem very complicated because you might think, why don't we just use this for everything? This is actually a little bit fragile. So I'll give you an example. The IRSC website, let's just use a round number. Say it has 1,000 different pages. So it links to 1,000 different places, maybe even probably more realistically. So a few years ago, the school's name wasn't IRSC, we were Indian River Community College. So we were ircc.edu. If we had used this technique for every single hyperlink, what would we have to do when the school changed its name to IRSC? Yeah, we'd have to change every single one of these to from IRCC to IRSC. With this, we don't have that problem because it doesn't really care what server it's on. So this tends to be much less fragile. It doesn't break as easily. Now, the other reason is that to use this, we actually do have to have a server set up with something called DNS. So it's not really practical to do on our own computers. But the bulk of the time, you end up doing this. It's only when you need to go to an external site that you're forced to do this because you can't really, you don't have much choice. At some point, you have to, there's a reason that URLs exist. Okay, so let's go over to your assignment. Now, I haven't gone over everything. Next class, I'll go over images, but you should have enough to get started. So if we go to assignments, again, use the code that we write in class as a starting point. If you find yourself going to all kinds of different places on the web to research information, you're probably not doing it in the most efficient manner. I give you everything that you need within the class examples, and then maybe read W3 Schools, some of the stuff that we talked about in class. But in general, the bulk of it is these class examples that we do. So yours is going to be very simple. Imagine you've got some sort of store, let's say a restaurant. You're going to have your main index.html page, just like we did in our example. Don't worry about image just yet. I'll show you how to work with images next class. Then you're going to have a folder called products, just like we had a folder called family. And within that one folder, you're going to have two pages, product1.html and product2.html. Anytime you see somebody write it like this, where it's got something name / like this, it sort of implies that there's a folder. So here I'm implying that there's a folder called images, because you do the same thing. You try to organize your stuff. So I've got a folder called images. I've got a folder called products. Then, so this assignment is purely about page structure. When you create the file names, as I mentioned before, you want to make them all lowercase. But let me go over some, actually I'll come back to this in a second. So there's some other things that we want to talk about. So index.html, it's going to contain the image, which we'll talk about next week. And then an H1 that says IRSC store. Index is going to have a hyperlink to product 1 and product 2. Only use relative paths. Don't use all these other techniques that you might find on other places on the web. Stick to the class example that we did. What we did today are called here and here. These are called relative links. Or I'm sorry, relative paths. And then product 1 and product 2, they won't have any images. Only the first page will have an image. And you want to be able to basically navigate like we did today. So from the home page, I want to be able to get to product 1 and product 2. And from product 1 and product 2, I want to be able to get back to my home page. Okay. Now here's the part, and I'll go over this again next week, that throws a lot of people off, is that you can't just submit individual files. It's going to cause problems. It's going to lose the link structure. So what you have to do is when you have your page, or when you have your assignment complete, so here we called it links, but you might have called it assignment 3. What you have to do is you have to right-click, send to, compressed folder, and it'll produce a file. In this case, it's links.zip, but yours would be like assignment3.zip. And then you'll submit that zip file. If you don't do it like that, you're going to lose your link structure or your folder structure. So it has to be done like this. And remember, these are recorded, so you can always go back. And then let's go to CGS1821. And then today, and then see that file links.zip. That's the file that you would submit for your assignment, okay? But remember, we haven't gone over images just yet, so some of you already know how to use images. You might be able to get through that part, but and you could just pick up a stock image from wherever. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. I don't think there's a whole lot of time to start. Maybe you can start kind of planning out your site a little bit. Actually, I do want to talk about one thing very quickly. So file naming. On Windows and Mac, these are the same file name, capital I and lowercase I. It's what's called case insensitive. On Linux, which most of you probably haven't used Linux, but these are two different file names. The file system is case sensitive. So you might think, well, why do I care? We're just using Mac and Windows. Most hosting companies, especially the hosting companies where you can get a plan for like $2 a month or something like that, most of them tend to be Linux-based hosts, and you probably don't even see it, going on in the background. They probably give you a nice like little interface to upload your files and everything. But what will happen if you use these interchangeably on your assignments? When you go to upload, which we're going to do later in the semester, onto a Linux-based server, all of a sudden you're going to have pages breaking. And it can be very confusing because it seems to work on your computer, but not on the server. So what I tell everybody is, just as a blanket rule, do everything across the board lowercase. The other thing is that don't use spaces inside of for your file names. So say, for example, instead of family, you might have written my family as the folder name. Don't use spaces. What ends up happening oftentimes is that these spaces get turned into these guys, these %20s, and it can be kind of a little bit difficult to read. You usually want to have readable URLs. So what do you do instead of spaces? Use dashes. Now this shouldn't affect the assignment because I already gave you all the file names to use, but just as reference for the future, don't use spaces. If you need to, use dashes. And then all lowercase, okay. So I think we're pretty much out of time. Any questions on anything? Okay, yes?
So I see here it says like product/product1. Is that going to be a separate folder for them?
So there'll be one folder for both, one folder called products with 2 items in it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions?